Oral questions. Questions orales. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, in an interview on American TV this weekend, the Prime Minister talked about NAFTA talks when it came to supply management. He said that we are moving forward. We have some flexibility in those areas, and I believe it's very, very promising. Which concessions did the Prime Minister make on supply management? Mr. Speaker, we are the party that created supply management. We're the party that will always defend it unequivocally and always have, and we will continue to do that. Dairy producers in Quebec and elsewhere in Canada know how much we're willing to stand up for them. We will always defend the supply management system. But if the Conservatives want to talk about supply management, I would ask the Leader of the Opposition why he appointed as critic for economic development and innovation someone who's against supply management.
Mr. Speaker, we've known for a long time that under this U.S. administration, our trade relationship has been volatile and under grave risk. Given this, can the Prime Minister tell us how much money was set aside in his budget and where we might find any mention of a contingency plan to deal with the trade disruption between Canada and the United States?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as we've said from the very beginning, with this particular American administration, we have to be ready for everything, and we are. That is why, as soon as the U.S. put forward punitive, unacceptable tariffs on steel and aluminum in Canada, we were right away ready with a list of retaliatory measures that target American companies, American producers, for which there are alternatives available to Canadian citizens. We know that tariffs end up hurting citizens of the country that brings them in. We want to avoid hurting Canadians. That's why we are consulting with Canadians on those retaliatory.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's own officials have confirmed that the deficit for this year will be over $18 billion. Can the Prime Minister tell us if he has any idea how much higher the deficit will be as a result of any support that may be necessary for industries and workers affected by the trade disruption between the United States and Canada?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite well knows that this government will be there for workers and industries affected by these punitive American measures. That's what I told steel and aluminum workers over the past months as I've traveled across the country to engage with them. But it's interesting that the member opposite speaks about deficits. In the last elections, Canadians had a very clear choice. Their choice, their option was actually austerity and cuts. Our proposal to Canadians was investing in the middle class and people working hard to join it, investing in our communities and growing the economy the way they weren't able to for 10 years.
Order. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, their budget has in fact turned out to be built on borrowing and tax cuts on those very same middle-class Canadians they pretend to want to help. Now, Mr. Speaker, tax hikes. Tax hikes.
Order. We all like applause most of the time, but not necessarily always. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition has the floor.
Fine. Sorry, Conservatives are always thinking about tax cuts, but I'll correct the blues after this and make sure. Mr. Speaker, on the subject of tariffs, we know that tariffs collected by this government will raise revenue for the Government of Canada. Will the Prime Minister assure the House and Canadians that any new revenue for the government will be used to lower taxes for affected workers and the businesses that employ them?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite pointed out that he thinks about tax cuts. The issue is they think about tax cuts for the wealthiest Canadians. The first thing we did was we brought in a tax cut for the middle class and we raised taxes on the wealthiest 1%. for 10 years, Mr. Speaker. They tried to put forward an agenda for growth that was focused on giving benefits and boutique tax cuts to the wealthiest Canadians and hoping that somehow it would trickle down to everyone else. Well, it didn't, which is why they had terrible growth for 10 years. We're investing in the middle class and those working hard to join them and giving them more money.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, now more than ever, Canada needs to open up new markets and diversify our trading relationships. Now, the Trans-Pacific Partnership will achieve just that. And despite the Prime Minister's delay and jeopardization of that deal, it is essential that this bill, implementing the deal, is passed quickly. When will the Prime Minister commit to introducing the legislation for this trade agreement, and can he commit that it will be passed before the House rises?
Hear, hear. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we are proud of the work that we've done in diversifying Canada's trades. Under this government, we signed the CETA deal with Europe, and we actually moved forward on a CPTPP, which highlights that a progressive trade deal can work for our workers and for the growing economies of Asia. We are pleased with our record on trade and growth, and we're happy to announce that we will be introducing into the House the bill for the ratification of the new CPTPP before the House rises for the summer.
The honourable member for Rimouski-Neigette-Témiscouata-les-Basques.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister promised Canadians he would be a climate change leader, and he committed to eliminate public subsidies for oil and gas companies. But climate change leaders don't buy pipelines with public money, and climate change leaders don't allow $3 million bonuses to be given to top oil executives. Climate change leaders do use public money to build long-term job creation in renewable energies. Can the government explain why it makes sense for a climate change leader to buy a pipeline?
Hear, hear. Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we made a commitment to Canadians that said that we understood that you need to grow the economy and protect the environment together. Now, those on the other side of the House would have Canadians believe that there's still a choice to be made between what's good for the economy or what's good for the environment. And we on this side of the House know that they must go together. That's why we're moving forward with a world-class oceans protection plan, a national price on carbon pollution, and getting our resources to new markets other than the United States for our oil. That's what we know we need to do. That's what we're going to keep doing, despite the false choice proposed by the members opposite.
The honourable member for Rimouski-Neigette.
Dollars in renewable energies, but they spent it on the pipeline.
Last week, the majority of members had the good sense to pass my colleague from Abitibi-Bay James Nunavik AU's bill to enshrine UNDRIP in Canadian law. The Prime Minister himself voted against this bill. How can he now claim he respects the rights of Indigenous peoples and at the same time force through a pipeline many First Nations oppose? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I had the privilege yesterday of sitting down with representatives of Indigenous communities who will be affected by this new pipeline, and we talked about the impact on their communities. This is a committee we struck to consult First Nations, to listen to them, and to make sure the impacts of the pipeline will be good impacts and they'll be minimized when they're adverse impacts. I'm looking forward to furthering our reconciliation work. We will keep working with all First Nations and respect all points of view by listening to them. The honourable member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. In 2015, the Prime Minister was a superstar, a breath of fresh air, a new environment champion. 3 years later, the entire world can't believe it. What has happened to Canada? What happened to Mr. Selfie, the new darling of Perry Match? After adopting Harper's targets, he buys a pipeline. Today we learned that when it comes to handouts to oil companies, Canada has the worst record of the G7, 7th out of 7. Will the Prime Minister ultimately keep his word, do the right thing, and eliminate subsidies to the oil patch? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, in 2015, there was a clear choice for Canadians. The NDP was proposing a choice between what's good for the environment and what's good for the economy. But we, in the Liberal Party, we told Canadians that we understood that in order to build a strong economy and protect the environment, you had to do both at the same time. And that's precisely what we're doing. We've put a national price on carbon. We're setting up Oceans Protection Plan, which will be historic, and we are seeking new markets for our resources. That's what Canadians expect.
You know, as the Prime Minister prepares to play host to the G7, Canadians and many around the world are asking themselves, what happened to this guy? We all remember that great defender of the planet who promised to end fossil fuel subsidies, but a new report shows that when it comes to the G7 and those same subsidies, Canada, out of 7, ranks 7th. That would be last. That would be after Donald Trump's America. So rather than eliminate the subsidies, this Prime Minister went out and bought a pipeline, a 65-year-old pipeline. When will he end this circle of hypocrisy and finally come clean with Canadians and keep his promise to them and to the world?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to have the opportunity to reinforce that we have indeed committed and are on track to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies by the year 2025. To do this, we announced in our very first budget the expiration of the tax write-offs on capital investments in LNG facilities. In Budget 2017, we announced the elimination of certain tax credits for exploration expenses in the oil and gas sector. We are developing our resources while protecting our environment, including safeguarding our oceans and combating climate change. Our government understands that a clean environment and a strong economy go hand in hand.
Allard.
Order. The honourable member for Mégantic L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government every day proves that it's completely out of touch with Canadian farmers. They called farmers tax cheats. They impose a carbon tax on them that they don't want. They want to change the food guide and impose labeling that makes no sense on our agricultural products. All of these were unexpected by farmers. My question is simple. Can the Prime Minister tell us whether he also believes that yogurt, cheese, and fruit juice are health hazards? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we're very proud of our support for our farmers. The Conservatives cut $700 million to agriculture, but we've reinvested since taking office in our hardworking farmers. We've entered into agreements that will allow our farmers to export $1.5 billion more to other countries, and we have entered into a comprehensive trade deal that will allow farmers to have access to $1 billion more in exports. We will always support Canadian farmers.
Trail Eagle Creek.
Mr. Speaker, farmers are struggling to survive and the Liberal-imposed taxes aren't helping. And now the Agriculture Minister is claiming that farmers support the Liberal carbon tax. The chair of the Western Canadian Wheat Growers said, and I quote, "I'm not sure who's been briefing the minister, but he's dead wrong if he thinks most farmers support a carbon tax." Does the Prime Minister agree with this minister that farmers like his carbon tax? Or will he listen to farmers and recognize that the carbon tax is crippling our farm families?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives like to talk a good game on farmers, but the reality is different. While the previous government cut nearly $700 million from agriculture and agri-food, we have invested in hardworking Canadian farmers. Our government signed CETA, which will boost our agricultural exports by $1.5 billion a year, and the CPTPP, which will boost our agriculture exports by over $1 billion a year. We've secured our $2 billion canola trade with China. We've invested $100 million in agricultural science and innovation. We've invested $350 million to help dairy farmers and processors modernize. We'll always support our Canadian.
The Honourable Member for Carleton.
The Prime Minister has a budget bill before the House of Commons right now that Finance Canada admits will raise the price of gas, home heating, and most other consumer goods that Canadians buy. How much will the Prime Minister's carbon tax cost the average Canadian family?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, for 10 years, Stephen Harper and his Conservatives did nothing on protecting the environment. However, over those years, a number of provinces stepped up and put forward price on carbon pollution. And actually, we have now, presently, a situation in which 80% of our economy, 80% of our citizens live in jurisdictions where there is a carbon price in effect. So we are continuing to move forward to demonstrate that a national price on carbon will be fair for those provinces who already have it and grow the economy for everyone.
The honourable member for Carleton.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if the provinces were already doing it, the Prime Minister would not have to introduce a budget bill forcing them to do it. Clearly, this is a federally imposed tax. And clearly, he would have read the briefing notes that his departments have given him about the cost of that tax. He knows the cost. So I ask again, how much will this Liberal carbon tax imposed by this Prime Minister cost the average Canadian family?
Simple.
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I hate to have to correct the member opposite, but in fact, it is during his government that many provinces moved forward on pricing carbon pollution. We have a situation in which British Columbia, Alberta, Quebec, and Ontario have all moved forward with pricing of carbon pollution, and we know that it has to be done right across the country. That's exactly what we are ensuring, but we're working with the provinces to ensure that they can put forward a model that works for them, as long as it is fairly stringent and impactful right across the country.
I'm having difficulty hearing the answers I'd like to ask them. With the St. Albert, Edmonton, and others, not to be yelling when someone else has the floor. It's very straightforward. The honourable member for Carleton.
Well, the Prime Minister uses the word stringent. There's no doubt that it will have a stringent effect on household budgets. There's also no doubt the Prime Minister supports high gas prices. He said so when he was out in Vancouver celebrating $1.60 a litre gas prices. There's also no doubt that his carbon tax will raise the price of consumer goods that middle-class Canadians rely upon. It's his bill. So how much will his carbon tax cost the average Canadian family?
Right, honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, unlike the years of the Harper Conservatives, we work with provinces as we move forward on pan-Canadian issues and projects. That's why we are working with provinces like Manitoba, Nova Scotia, and others to establish how they want to move forward on putting a price on pollution. We know we need a price on pollution across the country. It needs to be equivalent and effective right across the country, but every jurisdiction will get to determine how that money comes in and how they return that money to the people who need it.
The honourable member for Carleton.
We have no doubt that this Prime Minister will work with any politician as part of his plan to raise taxes on Canadians. It's his form of trickle-down economics. He scoops up money from working-class consumers, gives it to the federal government, trickles it down to provincial politicians, and then expects us to believe that a few drops will go back to the people who originally paid for it in the first place. If that's true, then why can't he tell us how much will his carbon tax cost the average Canadian family?
Right, honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the member opposite's expertise in trickle-down economics. That's what they specialized in for 10 years. They gave boutique tax credits to wealthy Canadians, delivered child benefit checks to millionaire families, and then when we move forward with lowering taxes for the middle class and raising them in the wealthiest 1%, they voted against it. Then we move forward on account of the child benefit that gives us more money to 9 out of 10 Canadian families and doesn't send child benefit checks to millionaires while lifting hundreds of thousands of kids out of poverty, and they voted against it. Mr. Speaker, their positions are clear.
The honourable member for Disnethi, Mississippi, Churchill River.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberals voted against the NDP motion to implement the rights of the Indigenous people in their pipeline project, but just a few days ago voted to put those same rights into Canadian law. The Prime Minister can't pretend that Indigenous voices are all the same. and ignore the clear opposition to his pipeline. They're denying the rights of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Does the government really not see that, or they just don't care?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I very much respect my the member opposite's voice, but I do need to highlight that there are a range of voices in Indigenous communities that we need to listen to all of them. There are people in the Indigenous communities who are opposed to this pipeline and to other economic development projects. There are some who are in favor of it, and we are working with all of them, including through entities like the Indigenous Advisory and Monitoring Council committee that we put together exactly for the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. We're going to continue to work in the spirit of reconciliation on a nation-to-nation relationship that respects UNDRIP.
No, member for Hochelaga. Mr. Speaker, yet another example of a government that talks a good talk, but when it comes time to make major decisions affecting the lives of all Indigenous communities, poof, they vanish into thin air. Last week, they voted to support the rights of Indigenous peoples. This week, they voted against our motion, which was a concrete way of supporting those rights. When it comes to Indigenous people's rights, can the Liberals do anything other than just talk, talk, talk? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I would submit that it's the NDP that just talks, talks, and talks. We are delivering to First Nations. We have eliminated a lot of the boil water advisories. We have built schools. We have entered into partnerships for treaties. We're working hand in hand with Indigenous communities all across the country to deliver on our promised reconciliation on a nation-to-nation basis, which we have committed to. We will continue working with First Nations with respect, and we won't claim to speak for them like the NDP does.
Mr. Speaker, in March, the President of the United States announced that he would be introducing tariffs on steel and aluminum. In May, he announced after that there would be an exemption for Canada and Mexico until May 1st. He announced a further extension of that exemption until June 1st, and most recently he indicated that, of course, the exemption was going to be lifted. All through that time, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister had the opportunity to consult on the tariffs that he is now proposing to counter the steel and aluminum tariffs. My question is simple. Why did he wait so long and put us in a position where we can't react right away?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to pause to thank Canadians. Over the past months and indeed over a year now, Canadians have been united in our approach on dealing with the U.S. administration. Across political lines, across provincial capitals, across industries, Canadians have been speaking with a clear and united voice that we stand together and we stand against punitive measures by the United States, that we will support our neighbours, that we will support our workers, and that we will remain united and proud Canadians. I want to thank all members in this House and all Canadians for the solidarity they continue to show on this issue.
The Honourable Member for Milton.
So, Mr. Speaker, Canadians really are watching what's going on because they're quite concerned. They see an economy that's going to be put at risk, and they're looking for answers from the Prime Minister. And unfortunately, today, we haven't received any answers from the Prime Minister. He was asked 4 times about how much a carbon tax would cost a Canadian family. He didn't tell us the answer. He was asked how much more deficit was going to be accumulated because of the trade war we're in. He didn't give us an answer. These are things that Canadians care about. He did give us one answer. He told us that he's going to introduce the legislation to affirm the CTPP, well, the free trade deal that we negotiated. So my question is, will he guarantee that it's going to pass?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I very much respect the laundry list the member put forward, but we can list the concrete results we've delivered for Canadians over the past 2.5 years, whether it be signing the CPTPP that they weren't moving forward on, whether it was concretizing a CETA that was in dire straits when we came into office, or whether it's delivering a energy infrastructure that will get our oil resources to new markets, which they failed to do for 10 years. Whether it's actually investing in infrastructure in our communities, lowering taxes for the middle class, raising on the wealthiest 1%. These are the things that...
L'honorable.
The honourable member for Richmond, Arthabaska. Mr. Speaker, when the Prime Minister announced the G7 would be held in Charlevoix, his government also said local workers would have a role to play. Unfortunately, that's not what's happening. Workers are finding themselves on forced unemployment. Can the Prime Minister tell the people of Charlevoix if compensation will be forthcoming? What's he going to do for hotel, inn, and restaurant owners who have no work for their employees before and during the G7? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, last week I had the opportunity to visit the Malbaie, that beautiful part of Charlevoix, to meet with people, and they talked about how proud they were to be hosting people in their area and how beautiful the region is and how they wanted to encourage people to come visit and discover this magnificent region. Obviously, they know there's going to be some disruptions, some problems because of all the visitors flooding into the area, and we're working with them, with elected officials, to try to make sure that it all goes smoothly. The honourable member for Richmond, Arthabaska. Mr. Speaker, holding an event like a G7 summit obviously has a big impact on locals. On one hand, we have honest workers who are being shut out of work. On the other, there will be consequences for local businesses and individuals affected by the usual vandals. So it's to be expected that government would step up and take care of people affected by vandals and provide compensation. So my question is, will the Prime Minister officially undertake to provide compensation to all those affected by vandals during the G7? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, as I said, I'm proud to be hosting people in the magnificent Charlevoix region, and when I was there, I saw that there was a company in La Baie in the Saguenay area that got the contract to deliver food for all the security staff and army staff that will be there. A lot of profits will be flowing into those communities, but I'd like to reassure my colleague that the compensation policies for local businesses are precisely the same as those that were in place with the Conservatives in 2010 when they hosted the summit.
The Honourable Member for Salaberry-sur-Roi. Mr. Speaker, this week we heard many traumatic accounts of sexual abuse against Canadian athletes. This situation is unacceptable, and the government must act to protect our athletes. In Canada, national sports organizations are responsible for monitoring themselves for sexual abuse. That can lead to a conflict of interest and jeopardize the safety of our athletes. When will the government take action to ensure the safety of these young people? The Right Honourable the Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, abuse in any shape or form is unacceptable, and the safety of our athletes and our coaches are our priority. All of them must be able to participate in sports in a harassment-free environment, and that is why all sports organizations funded by the federal government have had to implement a discrimination and harassment-free policy. We are currently looking at our funding policies in order to ensure that our organizations will continue to foster healthy and harassment-free environments.
Mr. Speaker, if policies are neglected, they're worthless. And the government has to have zero tolerance for sexual abuse in Canadian sports. Right now, the onus is on sporting organizations to be responsible for policing these complaints. That is not fair to these organizations. Canada needs an independent body to handle cases of sexual abuse in Canadian sport. Under the recent Safe Sports Act in the United States, independent bodies investigate these cases. It's time for Canada to do the same. When is the government going to step up?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this government and all Canadians have been very clear. Harassment of any kind is completely unacceptable, and the safety and security of athletes, coaches, and officials is always our top priority. All Canadians deserve the opportunity to participate in a sport environment that is free of discrimination, harassment, and harmful behaviour. That is why all federally funded sport organizations must have an anti-discrimination, harassment and abuse policy in place in order to be eligible for sports support program funding, which Sport Canada reviews to ensure compliance. We are currently reviewing our existing funding policies to ensure that organizations continue to promote harassment-free environments.
The honourable member for Vancouver Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the real impacts of climate change cannot be understated. The challenges governments face is striking the right balance between an evolving economy and protection of the environment now and for future generations. The Minister of the Environment and Climate Change repeatedly says we are in this together as a global community. So international collaboration is key to leaving a healthy environment and a strong economy to our kids and grandkids. Can the Prime Minister describe Canada's global plan to meet these global challenges?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member from Vancouver Centre for her question. Strong action is needed to tackle climate change, all while generating the long-term economic development that will grow the middle class and support a clean economy. Yesterday, on World Environment Day, we appointed Patricia Fuller as Canada's new Ambassador for Climate Change. Working together on climate change, oceans and clean energy is one of the key themes of our G7 presidency. We're working to ensure we're leaving a healthy environment and a strong economy to our kids and grandkids.
Honourable member for Lethbridge.
Well, we only wish that was true. Canada is a country rich with natural resources, home to innovative businesses, and populated by hardworking Canadians. Our country should be attracting investment, but instead we're repelling it. In fact, we're so opposed to private sector investment in the energy sector that we've killed 3 pipeline projects worth over $100 billion. And now, we've taken $4.5 billion and given it to Kinder Morgan to go and take their projects elsewhere. When will the Prime Minister stop attacking Canada's energy sector and start putting the interests of Canadians first?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, on the member's first comment, it is true we did just appoint Patricia Fuller as Canada's new Ambassador for Climate Change. On the issue of pipelines, for 10 years, they tried to move forward on getting our oil resources to new markets, and they failed. They failed because they refused to understand that the only way to grow a strong economy is to protect the environment at the same time. That is what we are demonstrating with a national price on carbon pollution, on a world-class oceans protection plan, on $8 billion worth of investment in clean energy projects and renewable technologies. We know the way.
The honourable member for Edmonton Riverbend.
Mr. Speaker, in Kinder Morgan's 2017 annual report to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, they valued the Trans Mountain Pipeline at $2.5 billion. Yet this Prime Minister paid $4.5 billion to purchase the pipeline. We now know that a lot of the extra padding went to the executive bonuses. If Kinder Morgan says their pipeline is worth $2.5 billion, why did the Prime Minister pay them $4.5 billion of taxpayer money to leave Canada?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's a real shame to see the trapped ideology of the Conservatives playing politics with this issue. I can tell them. I was just in Alberta yesterday talking to oil sands workers, talking to pipeline workers who are deeply grateful that we are able to move forward on building this pipeline project after years of the Conservatives being unable to do so. And why were the Conservatives unable to do so? Because they didn't understand that the only way to build a strong economy is to protect the environment at the same time. This government is doing both, and that is why we're getting it done.
The honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, $4.5 billion in taxpayer money is going directly to Houston, Texas. That is 6 times as much of the money that Kinder Morgan valued the pipeline at. Mr. Speaker, when Kinder Morgan executives signed this deal...
No, instead they say, Houston, it's party time. $4.5 billion of Canadian tax money takes to the Liberal Party of Canada.
Mr. Speaker, why is the Liberal government sending $4.5 billion to Texas?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Order.
Mr. Speaker, I understand why the Conservatives are completely lost on this issue. For years, they have wanted us to do what they couldn't do, and that's build a pipeline to new markets outside the States. They didn't manage to do that, but we did. And now we have finally delivered on what they wanted. Well, they've got to try and find some other way of attacking us and play petty politics. But fortunately, workers throughout Canada understand that we did the right thing for them.
For Barry Innisfil.
Before selling the Trans Mountain Pipeline to the Prime Minister for $4.5 billion, Kinder Morgan valued its Canadian assets at $2.5 billion. That's quite a deal, Mr. Speaker, if you're Kinder Morgan.
Yeah.
Kinder Morgan didn't ask for any Canadian tax dollars. All they wanted to do was build a pipeline. Why did the Prime Minister pay Kinder Morgan $2 billion more than the pipeline was worth and allow Kinder Morgan to invest and create jobs outside of this country?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, one has to almost feel sorry for the Conservatives. For 10 years, they tried to get this done and were unable to do. Then, for 2.5 years, while we were in government, they've been screaming at us to get this pipeline built. And now, when we're finally getting this pipeline built, they don't know what to do with themselves. So they fall back on their silly attacks, on their playing politics, on their rigid ideology that somehow suddenly doesn't think that public investment has any place in the development of our natural resources, which, of course, the great Peter Lougheed disagreed with them on that. We know, Mr. Speaker, we're doing the right thing.
The Honourable Member for Victoria.
A Senate report has just concluded that Canadians who use cannabis after it's legalized and try to cross the border to the United States could be denied entry. But worse, those who don't answer certain questions in pre-clearance could face up to 2 years in prison under Bill C-23, calling it resisting or willfully obstructing an American officer, even on Canadian soil. Can the Prime Minister confirm whether or not Canadians who simply refuse to answer American officers in Canada about their cannabis use could face fines or imprisonment?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Let me be very clear about one thing, Mr. Speaker. The reason we are moving forward on legalization of marijuana is because the current system does not work. It doesn't protect our kids from the harmful impact of marijuana, and it delivers billions of dollars every year to criminal organizations who make profits off of that. We are also highlighting that cannabis isn't somehow a positive health food supplement that we encourage everyone to use. It is a controlled substance. We're trying to make it more difficult for kids to access, and people need to be honest when they cross the border as they choose to enter a different country.
Hello.
Order. The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly.
Speaker, Conservatives and Liberals voted for Bill C-23, which gave unprecedented powers to American border officers on Canadian soil. Luckily, the NDP was here raising exactly these concerns, because now what we're seeing through the Senate report is that with the legalization of marijuana, any person on Canadian soil not crossing the border subject to another country's laws here in Canada could potentially be fined or imprisoned under that very legislation.
So my question for the Prime Minister is simple. Is that the case, yes or no? And when will he finally address this issue with his American counterparts? The Right Honourable the Prime Minister.
Of course, in ongoing discussions with our American counterparts on a broad range of border issues, and we will continue to. But at the same time, I hope the NDP isn't suggesting that somehow a sovereign country can't make determinations about how it handles people entering on its own borders. Of course, we would never expect or allow any other country to dictate to us who or how we can or cannot let someone into our country. We will ensure that we are also respecting other countries' sovereignty in doing that at the same time as we stand up for Canadians and, of course, for the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Honourable Member for Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces were ordered to return their sleeping bags and rucksacks because of an equipment shortage. The Prime Minister is failing our Canadian Armed Forces. Already he broke the Liberal promise and cut another $2.3 billion from defence spending.
This is unacceptable. How can Canadians trust the Prime Minister to buy Navy ships and fighter jets when he can't even get buying sleeping bags right? And how can we trust him to provide the right equipment to our troops who are about to deploy to Mali?
Mr. Speaker, here we go again. The Conservatives pretend they're friends to our troops, but for 10 years they underinvested, they politicized, they played games with procurement, they nickel and dimed our veterans, and yet are easy to stand up with inflated rhetoric anytime there's a challenge. We are going to continue to work with the men and women of our Canadian forces, ensure they have the equipment, the support they need to do their jobs as they stand up for Canada, put their lives and livelihoods on the line. We continue to support our troops, not just in words like them, but with dollars and cents that go the distance.
The Honourable Member for Charlesbourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. Order. Mr. Speaker, on the 6th of June 1944, 14,000 soldiers ended up on the Normandy Beach. And on the 6th of June 1918, in 2018, our soldiers were asked to return their rucksacks and sleeping bags. That makes no sense. But what's happening at the same time? $10 million for Omar Khadr, $4.5 billion on a pipeline. More than $7 million for a temporary skating rink. How can our Prime Minister send our soldiers to Mali under conditions like this? The Honourable Member for Charlesbourg Haute-Saint-Charles knows that his questions have to be directed through the Speaker. That is how it is done here. The Right Honourable, the Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the member wanted to politicize an important event, but we on this side of the House believe that it's important to pay tribute to those who were fallen in these important fights. Their determination to uphold freedom, peace, has been transferred to future generations, and we must show gratitude for their perseverance, and we salute all those men and women who played such an important role. We will never forget them.
Member for Caribou, Prince George.
Mr. Speaker, responding to questions about the Fisheries Minister's surf clam decision, the minister's most senior official confirmed that the Liberal-connected Five Nations had the lowest participation, First Nations participation out of all the applicants. She also confirmed that she had no knowledge of the minister's family connection to the unincorporated entity. She confirmed multiple times that this was the minister's sole personal decision. When did the minister become aware of the minister's family connections, and when did he know that Five Nations had the least amount of Indigenous participation?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our decision to introduce Indigenous participation is consistent with our commitment to developing a renewed relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples. Enhancing access to the Arctic surf clam fishery broadens the distribution of benefits from this public resource and is a powerful step toward reconciliation. When the Conservatives went through a similar process to increase access to this fishery, they chose to exclude Indigenous peoples. And of course, the member will continue to work with the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner and follow his advice.
The Honourable Member for Saint-Léonard Saint-Michel. Mr. Speaker, Montreal Public Transit has the highest public transit use in the country, whether it be the metro, the bus, or bike sharing. Montrealers make green travel choices. I was very pleased when our government announced its contribution to the Blue Line extension to Anjou. I would like to ask the Minister of Infrastructure how the government is contributing to the maintenance of the current network and ensuring that these high-quality services last. Honourable Minister, I would like to thank the member for his question. Public transit is a priority for our government. It allows Canadians to spend less time on the road and more time with their families. And I am proud that this year we announced more than $450 million into public transit so that they could buy buses, buy a new garage, and renovate the new metro system in Montreal. That is what investing in our communities looks like.
Thompson Caribou.
Mr. Speaker, 3 years ago, a young Cree girl was suffering chronic pain and taking daily medication for a jaw misalignment. She simply needed $6,000 in dental work. Instead of showing compassion and common sense, they decided to take Josie and her family to court for $110,000 in costs to fight. 7 months ago, we suggested it was time to quit the fight and show some compassion and change the policy. Can the Prime Minister tell us how this represents, using taxpayers' dollars, is reconciliation?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, in 2015, Canadians asked our government to step up on reconciliation and build a new relationship, nation to nation, with Indigenous peoples, and that's exactly what we're doing. In partnership with them, in respect with them, we are working with Indigenous communities across this country to respond to their needs, to deliver on the services they need, to build the housing, invest in the schools, create the infrastructure necessary for them to determine their own future, for them to thrive in this country. We are doing this hand in hand, in partnership, in respect, and that is what we will continue to do, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Longueuil-Saint-Hubert. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, after 2 years, 1 month, and 14 days of endless consultations, the Minister of Heritage announced, and I can't quite believe it, measures, a reform. No, she announced a new advisory group of experts. The second in 2 years that will give its recommendations, wait for it, in 2020, after the next elections. That is the height of cynicism. Yet 2 years ago, the Minister was boasting about her political courage and new legislative changes in 2017. Isn't doing nothing for 4 years, jeopardizing all culture just to get re-elected on the back of our culture? The Right Honourable the Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we are going to continue to protect and promote our culture. The Broadcasting Act has not been modernized since 1991. That dates back to before smartphones. We are reviewing the Act so that it reflects today's reality and so that the system today is fair for all. The principle informing this process is clear. If you're profiting by it, then you have to pay your fair share. There is no free pass. We never want Harper's cuts to happen again.
August Streetsville.
Canada is generally a very safe country, but there's been recent trends in an increase of gun and gang violence. The responsibility of keeping communities safe starts at home, and working with communities to prevent crime will help them stay safe and resilient. Can the Prime Minister tell us what our government is doing to keep Canadian kids away from gangs that will allow them to live full and productive lives?
Thank you.
The Honourable Prime Minister.
I thank the member from Mississauga-Streetsville for his question. Today, we are launching a new call for proposals under the Youth Gang Prevention Program and the Crime Prevention Action Fund. These programs address the impacts of gangs and violence on youth, especially in Indigenous and high-needs communities. This is on top of unprecedented annual funding we announced last year of up to $100 million. We will keep working to enhance public safety by focusing on prevention, effective law enforcement, and strong community partnerships.
The Honourable Member for Beauport-Limoilou. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister spoke about the CRTC Act. Well, the last time the Official Languages Act was reviewed was under the Conservatives in 1988. With new challenges and issues facing them, Francophones, Acadians, and even Anglophones in Quebec all agree that the Act has to be modernized now, Mr. Speaker. Even the federal court, agreed and has suggested that legislators review the Act. Mr. Speaker, the government is alone in not adding its voice to this. What is the Prime Minister waiting for to begin modernizing the Act? The Right Honourable the Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the Official Languages Act is absolutely essential and a priority for our party and for the country. Protecting official languages minority communities throughout the country is at the heart of who we are as a country, and we will continue to defend and to improve the Official Languages Act. And I can confirm that we are about to modernize the Official Languages Act, and we will be working with all Canadians to make sure we do it the right way.
Or Nunavut.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Prime Minister. 2 communities in my riding have recently declared they're in crisis. These declarations stem from the fact that there are too few mental health supports, and an increased number of suicide attempts. Of the recent $118 million announced for First Nations and Inuit mental health, Nunavut only receives $500,000 annually, despite the fact that the suicide rate is 10 times the national average. This government has sent additional support to First Nation communities in crisis. My question is, will the government do the same for Inuit communities? Thank you.
The Honourable Prime Minister.
I thank the member from Nunavut for his question. We recognize that the mental health challenges facing Indigenous people are deep-rooted and that the need for support is immense. In Nunavut, we are working with our partners and have invested $189 million over 10 years in the community-led Nunavut Wellness Agreement, as well as $8.4 million this year alone for mental health support for Inuit. We are supporting ITK's National Inuit Suicide Prevention Strategy and will continue to work with partners to respond to the mental health needs in the territory.
The honourable member for Beauport-Limoilou is rising on a point of order.